Imagine you have spent years on a waiting list for services that would allow you to live in your own home, work in your community, and maintain relationships with the people who matter most to you. You finally get approved, services begin, and then a budget cycle happens, and those services are reduced or eliminated, not because you no longer need them, but because the funding structure that supports your life in the community is discretionary and capped and always vulnerable. That is not a hypothetical. That is the reality facing individuals served by Kentucky's Michelle P. waiver, and it is the consequence of proposed home and community-based services, or HCBS, funding reductions at the state and federal level. I argue that these cuts are not neutral budget decisions. They reflect a structural bias toward institutionalization that contradicts disability rights law, sound fiscal policy, and our professional ethics as social workers. The scale of this issue is important to understand. Nationally, more than 4.5 million people rely on Medicaid HCBS to remain in their communities. In Kentucky, the Michelle P. waiver services thousands of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and thousands more sit on waiting lists, some for years, because enrollment is capped by state discretion. Recent federal proposals, including funding reductions, threaten to deepen this gap at the same moment that a 2026 Department of Justice opinion has signaled a retreat from the federal enforcement of the Olmstead Community Integration Mandate. The timing compounds the vulnerability of an already disadvantaged population. To understand why this bias exists, we need to name the ideological frameworks that shaped it. The first is residualism, the idea that public support should function as a safety net of last resort. This thinking has shaped the original Medicaid architecture, which centered on acute and institutional care. Community-based services were an afterthought, existing outside the mandatory benefit structure, which is why they remain vulnerable when budgets tighten. The second is institutionalism, the long-standing assumption that people with significant disabilities belong in specialized facilities. This assumption was challenged legally by the Olmstead Supreme Court decision in 1999, but it was never dismantled structurally. The mandatory entitlement for nursing facility care is institutionalism written into statute, a policy default that community integration has been fighting against for 50 years. Together, these ideologies explain why HCBS is always the more precarious option. The Michelle P. waiver is, in many respects, a policy success story. It provides community living supports, behavioral services, and person-centered planning to individuals with IDD. It is built on principles of self-determination and the least restrictive environment. It works when it is adequately funded and when providers can maintain staffing. But the gaps are significant. Enrollment caps mean eligible individuals wait years for services that already exist. Provider rates have not kept pace with inflation or minimum wage increases, producing a direct support workforce crisis in which agencies cannot maintain staffing, and individuals lose services not because the system failed to authorize them, but because no one is available to deliver them. The gap between system design and system funding is the problem. My recommendation is this. Kentucky should implement provider rate reform tied explicitly to direct service provider wage floors, structured as a condition of Medicaid participation. This idea isn't new. It's an evidence-based one. Ohio included a $1.3 billion Medicaid rate investment tied to DSP wages in the 2024-25 budget. The result was measurable. Full-time DSP vacancy rates dropped from 16% to 12% in a single year. Research using National Core Indicators Staff Stability Survey data confirms that wages are the most significant factor associated with DSP retention. Rate reform tied to wage floors stabilizes the workforce, protects provider capacity, and is fiscally defensible because the alternative, shifting individuals to institutional settings, costs significantly more. I want to address two possible counter-arguments to this proposal. The first objection is fiscal. We cannot afford to expand HCBS right now. The Kaiser Family Foundation's analysis of Medicaid data found that HCBS costs averaged just over $36,000 per person compared to more than $47,000 for institutional care. Cutting community services does not eliminate costs, it relocates them to a more expensive setting. The second objection is one of priority. Why this population over others? The answer is that the structural reform I am recommending benefits every population that depends on HCBS, not just Michelle P. waiver recipients. Aging Kentuckians, individuals with behavioral health needs, children with complex medical conditions all rely on the same community-based infrastructure that is undermined by the same structural bias. Here's my call to action. Contact your state legislators on the Appropriations and Health and Human Services Committees. Show up to public comment periods on waiver renewals. Bring a story that makes the budget number human. Join advocacy coalitions that already have the legislative relationships to amplify constituent voices. The NASW code does not ask us to advocate when it is convenient. It asks us to do so because it's right. The people on our caseloads cannot afford for us to treat this as someone else's fight. As such, we have both the tools and the obligation to fix the problem.